So here we are in chapter 7. So we're at the Nile in the morning, and we're trying to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. All fair enough. How are we going to do that convincing? Well, Moses is going to strike the water with the staff that's in his hand, and the Nile is going to turn to blood, and the fish are going to die. And the Egyptians, as a result, naturally enough, won't be able to drink from the Nile, which is something of a bummer for them. So far, so good. Easy enough. Until we get to the next verse. In the next verse, Moses now turns to Aaron and tells him to take his staff and hold it out over the waters of Egypt. Not just the Nile, but all the water everywhere, right? This isn't striking a body of water. This is like a broad gesture. Obviously, Aaron can't hold his arm over the entirety of all the water in Egypt. Okay, so that's all the stuff that's been instructed. What happens then? Well, they do what God commanded, which is what exactly? Well, we're told he strikes the Nile with his staff and the water of the Nile turns to blood. Excellent. That's what Moses was supposed to do. And the fish die and the Nile stinks, so the Egyptians can't drink from it. All still good, what Moses was told to do. And then there's blood everywhere in the land of Egypt. But that's from what Moses said to Aaron, not what God said to Moses. And then in the next verse, the Egyptian magicians do the same thing. How? Which same thing do they do? The Nile is still blood, right? The Egyptians are unable to drink from it. How could the magicians do that again? And indeed, at the end of the story, right, we know the Nile is still blood. And this line is almost funny in our canonical text. If there's blood, as the Bible said, everywhere, right, in every drop of water, it's become blood, then the Egyptians digging around looking for water elsewhere is like a comic moment, because there isn't any water to be found. They can't dig around looking for drinkable water. It's all blood, right? But what a bunch of idiots. So for even such a familiar story, it's pretty confusing when we read it in the actual biblical text. But we've already laid the groundwork for the solution. We've had some obvious pairs of problems as we've been reading through, right? Who's acting? Moses or Aaron? And where is the blood? Is it just in the Nile? Or is it everywhere in every body of water in Egypt? If you follow the contradictions, separating them from each other, and follow the continuities, the parts that clearly belong together, here's what happens. We end up with two stories. Now, I realize this is a long slide, but it's all text you've seen before. In one of these stories, which is the J story, we have indeed Moses striking the Nile, right, and turning the Nile to blood, just as God said to him. And in this story, the plague lasts, right? This is a highly unpleasant thing for the Egyptians. Right? God gives him the instructions. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to say, I'm going to strike the Nile with the staff, and it's going to stink, and the fish are going to die, and they're not going to be able to drink. And that's exactly what happens. And that's like very problematic for the Egyptians, to be sure. The other story, which is from our P source, has Aaron making all the water in Egypt turn to blood everywhere. There's no mention of the Nile. And Aaron holds his arm out over the water and it all turns to blood. And logically enough, it's only in this story that the magicians can do what they do, right? They can replicate the trick. Because in this story, the water turning to blood isn't a painful experience for anyone. It's a magic trick, right? And it lasts for only a moment. Right? Aaron strikes the water, it turns to blood. Everyone goes, whoo, that's amazing. And it turns back. And the magicians go, not such a big deal. And they do the same thing, turns to blood, turns back, and Pharaoh's unimpressed. This is not really a plague, right? It is rather a sign of God's power. And without going through the entire plagues sequence bit by bit, let me simply say that what we see here is consistent throughout the entirety of the plague cycle. Each story, J and P, has distinctive features, and all you have to do is follow them through. They are incredibly repetitive from plague to plague. So let me briefly lay them out for you. In J, Moses always has a speech for Pharaoh that precedes the plague. And he's always given him fair warning. Right? Let the people go, or else. In J, the plagues take place over time. Right? The plague of blood lasts for a week. Right? And the plague of blood, you'll remember, starts right tomorrow in the morning. Right? There's always a passage of time between each one of those, right? Giving Pharaoh space, right? To change his mind, to stop being so stubborn, to think about what's about to happen, to plead for forgiveness. Right? It's a real process in J. In J, Moses always asks for permission for the people to go worship in the wilderness every single time. Right? By the way, while we're here, we should remember that Moses' request to go worship in the wilderness is a ruse. Right? He's not actually asking to go worship in the wilderness. Moses knows that as soon as Pharaoh says, okay, you can go worship, they are going to book it to Canaan. Right? Now, the fact that they do end up at a mountain in the wilderness is something that happens by chance afterward. But the whole premise here is Moses is trying to pull a fast one on Pharaoh. And Pharaoh, to his credit, for most of the plagues, kind of sees through it. In the J plagues, Pharaoh slowly relents bit by bit. Right? He says no for a while. Then he says, okay, you can worship, but you can't leave. You have to worship here. Then he says, okay, just the men. Then he says, okay, just the men, but not the animals. And he's slowly letting them go until the very end, right? Until the death of the firstborn, when indeed he does let them all go. That's all typical of the J story. In P, by contrast, there are no warnings to Pharaoh. Right? The plagues just happen. And there's no passage of time either. Moses and Aaron show up in front of Pharaoh, and they start doing these signs, right? These plagues, and they just stand there and do them one after another. Bang, 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 bang. In P, Moses, except at the very beginning, never asks for anything. He doesn't preface each plague with a request. Again, he's just standing there doing one after another after another. And perhaps most importantly, in the P story, Pharaoh never gives any kind of permission for the Israelites to go, because in P, Pharaoh isn't allowed to. It's in the P story that we find the notion of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Right? What does that mean? To harden Pharaoh's heart. What it means is God makes Pharaoh act against Pharaoh's own will or desires. Right? Even if Pharaoh wanted to let the Israelites go, he can't, because God is forcing him not to. And it's in this really that we get to the major distinction between the two stories, the two traditions here. In J, the point of the plagues is to get Pharaoh to let Israel go. In P, it isn't. The point of the plagues in P is to demonstrate God's power to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Indeed, P actually never calls them plagues. P calls them signs. In P, God knows that he can take Israel out of Egypt whenever he wants to, but God wants to punish Egypt first. So he hits them over and over again with increasing intensity. But he never allows Pharaoh to let the people go. That's not what God wants. And P says clearly what the point of this is right at the beginning. I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. That's the point. The J story is full of tension, right? At every single one of the plagues. Is this the one? Will Pharaoh relent? Will God actually like be able to take the Israelites out now? Will Pharaoh give in? The P story has no tension whatsoever. And this actually plays out beautifully in the climax of the stories, which is, of course, the departure from Egypt itself. It's in J that we get the people hurrying, right? Taking their dough before it's leavened, right? The famous story of the matzah, right? They have to hurry. Why? Because Pharaoh might change his mind, right? He's been so fickle and stubborn throughout. What if he changes his mind suddenly? We'd better go now before he changes his mind. So they leave in the middle of the night, almost secretly. P, by contrast, when it talks about Israel leaving, has no such haste or secrecy. They just leave in the middle of the day. Now, you'll notice how the combination in our text of these two different takes on this story, the combination has resulted in a relatively weird text. Why does Moses keep asking Pharaoh to let the people go if God is going to keep hardening Pharaoh's heart so that he can't? Well, now you know why, because no one ever wrote a story like that. It's also probably worth saying, neither J nor P has 10 plagues. Some plagues, like the blood plague, are in fact represented in both sources, though differently. Some are only in one source or the other. And here's a list with arrows and color coding to help you. Right, so the P is in red, J is in blue. In the canonical text, the shared plagues are in black, and the plagues that belong to one or the other are in their appropriate colors. So you can see we have 10 canonical plagues, but we don't have 10 in either J or P. And actually, when you think about it, 10 wasn't really a particularly accurate number anyway, since it, in fact, ignores the opening element of the P story. The first sign and wonder in P is Aaron's staff changing into, and here I'm going to tell you something else you didn't know, changing into a crocodile, not a serpent, despite what your English translations will all say. Aaron's staff changes into a crocodile, which in the end is honestly more impressive, really, than a snake. Now, you may be saying to yourself, especially since I didn't go through the entirety of the thing, and because perhaps you doubt me generally, you may be saying, that's all very clever what you've done right there, but where's the proof? And I am here to tell you that the plagues is one of the lovely places in the Bible where we have something approximating proof, or at least close enough to proof for me to show it to you. And for it, I'm going to have to leave the world of the Pentateuch and Exodus altogether. There are two major poems in the Hebrew Bible, both of them in the book of Psalms, that recount Israel's history. One of them is Psalm 105, where the plagues story looks like this. So here's the same kind of chart with Psalm 105 in the middle. And you can see that what we have in Psalm 105 is something akin to the canonical story. It has elements of P and elements of J interwoven and combined. Some stuff might be missing, but the only way you get to Psalm 105 is if you're reading both P and J together. The other psalm that tells Israel's history, however, is Psalm 78, where the story of the plagues looks like this. He said too soon. Now, what do you notice about this one? In Psalm 78's telling of the plagues, there's no darkness and there's no lice. That is the two plagues that are unique to the P story. And there are references to the J plagues. And in fact, if you read Psalm 78 and you look at the way that it describes it, when it gets to the plague of blood, for example, it mentions the fact that the fish die. Right? So it almost directly quotes J specifically. Which is all to say, Psalm 78 seems to know only J's plague story. And this is in fact true of Psalm 78 throughout. In its whole telling of Israel's past, it really only ever refers to J's narrative. Now, I will admit, this is not as good as, I don't know, finding a manuscript of J in the desert. Oh, someday. But it's still pretty good, I think. This is pretty good as far as proof goes. Now, again, I want to suggest that doing this kind of reading, that is identifying sources, is useful in multiple ways. First, it allows us to understand why the text we have is sometimes so confusing. That's nice. Second, it reminds us that there isn't a single truth, and certainly not any historical veracity, to be found in these stories, which is also very useful. And third, it gives us insight into the various ways that ancient Israel understood itself and understood its past and understood its deity. Right? P, I think it should be relatively clear, has a pretty different view of how God operates in the world. And that view is just as biblical as J's, despite the fact that it's, P's notion of God not bringing plagues but doing signs just to show off has been kind of obscured in our canonical text.